702 Weekend Breakfast, the future of.
Welcome back to 702 Weekend Breakfast with me, Gogsim Mhlungum. Time for us to look to the future. And this week, we're looking at the future of our cities, but not just in general, but looking at how can we design sustainable cities. Now, this coming Thursday, the 31st of October, is World Cities Day. There is an opportunity for the international community to talk about, so what is the future of our cities? How do we build sustainable cities? For example, a city like Lagos is said to be sinking. And within the next, I think, 100 years, it's expected that Lagos is not going to be livable. A city like Jakarta, the capital city of Indonesia, is currently, as we speak, sinking. And in fact, Indonesia is currently building a new capital city. They are moving their capital city because the current one is sinking. So there's some really big, urgent questions we need to be asking about what cities look like, how do we live in them, how do we make them sustainable. And this week, UKZN, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, is going to be doing a webinar on World Cities Day, and it will be looking at climate change and activism, specifically the youth perspective, because young people, well, they are going to be living in unprecedented times if nothing is done to deal with the issue of climate change. And joining us this morning to talk about World Cities Day, how to design sustainable cities, we're joined via Zoom by Dr. Ayobami Popola. They're a research associate and the South African Research Chairs Initiative Chair for Inclusive Cities at UKZN. Dr. Popola, thank you so much for your time this morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Gooks. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for your time. So this year, we're looking at the global observance of World Cities Day. There is a theme that's been focused on by the University of KZN, specifically looking at young people and climate change and what that means for cities. Why is it so important to be talking about youth when we think about the future of cities and what sustainable, livable cities look like?
Thank you very much, good, for that question. Within the SACHI Chair for Inclusive City, what we just tried to do to mark the World Cities Days, as you have mentioned, was just to link up with what the world is doing as at that time. The United Nations has marked that particular day for the World Cities Day, and the focus is on the youth. And the reason why we took up that challenge within the chair to also go that line of climate change action and activity and youth perspective is because while other continents across the globe, in Europe, while they are experiencing aging, in Africa, it's a youth boom. In fact, many people have argued that in Africa, we are in a decade of the youth now. Mm-hmm. Our population, average population is between the ages of 13 and 25. That shows that everything that happens in Africa, not just South Africa alone, touches on the youth. And that's why we felt we did the SACHI Chair for Inclusive City, which is our mandate to capture everybody's experience. It was very critical for us. And as our research chair would say, Professor Magbisha Chibugu, it's very important that we capture youth position on issues around climate change. And that's why we took the bull by the horn to try and look at issues of climate change from the youth perspective.
Doctor, when many of us think of cities and I guess the future, in our minds, we think that cities are pretty robust, right? Cities are buildings, transport networks, they are businesses, and, we think of them as pretty robust and that, they'll be okay. They'll stand, in some cities are hundreds of years old. But it seems that, as we are discussing, the future of the planet, the future of young people, we're acknowledging that while cities are pretty tough, they can't necessarily in their current form remain. There needs to be something done to make them a little bit tougher. And so what are those things, if we're thinking about cities and hoping to have them for another 100, 200 years, whatever it is, that we need to be thinking about to make them last that long? And not just make them last that long, but make them livable, because ultimately people must be able to live there.
Oh, you're very much right. The general perception is that, cities are very strong. There are places where we have the headquarters of our municipalities and the likes, and they have all the infrastructure, so to say. But that's not always the case, just like you pointed out. And the easiest way to respond to your question of what we need to do is a project that some of our funders and us have been doing. For example, one of our major funders, the South African City Networks, are focused on four strands to say, like, if South African cities will be sustainable and resilient, under their Sustainable and Resilient City program, they've identified four things, which I think are cut across even what we are discussing here, what we'll be discussing on the 31st of this month. The first one they touched on was issues around water management. And the second one was issues around climate change. The third one, sustainable energy. And the fourth one, which they touched on, was issues around waste management. And when you look at these things, even in city where you reside or where I reside, and where even University of KwaZulu-Natal is Durban, these are peculiar issues that we have in our city. Water management, access, maintenance of our infrastructure, climate change issues around distortion of season, issues around shorter season, issues of increasing temperature. The heart generally, the Africa generally, and even across the globe, has become warmer by 1 degree Celsius. Issues around sustainable energy. Almost everybody across the nation now, even most severely in South Africa, we are much more getting used to load shedding now. Those are sustainable energy issues. And even waste. You can barely go to any city within South Africa, even across Africa now. Even in Europe, to see, you rarely see a place where it's litter free. You go places, you see issues of littering, and the collection, the generation to collection rate is not at par. There seems to be a lower rate of collection to what we are generation. And these are issues that we need to revisit. Even down to our design, how we arrange our buildings, our RDP homes, how we design our home, where do we put our homes, where our informal settlements, how are they emerging? You see, our young people, many of them are residents within the informal settlement. And these are issues that call for concern. They want to live in the city. They want the city experience, but yet they don't have access to good housing within the city space. So the result is living in slip slope, living in wetlands, in informal settlement. These are some of the issues that we need to be focusing on. And some of them we'll be touching on even on Thursday as we have this discussion from our experts. That's what.
Doctor, you speak about, one of the big questions is around, in the cities, where and how do people live? I remember reading the eThekwini's climate plan, and one of the things they acknowledged is that I think it's about 50% of people who live in informal settlements live on some kind of floodline or floodplain, while at the same time the municipality expects that flooding, heavy rains as we have seen in eThekwini, the KZN region, are going to become the norm. I imagine that might be a similar situation in lots of other parts of the country, especially our metros, Cape Town, Johannesburg, Tshwane, where you have large numbers of people. We know, for instance, in Gauteng, people living on the floodline of the Yukskay River. We see flooding every year during the rainy season, which we're about to be in. And so when we think about where people are and how climate change is going to impact them if we're seeing heavier rains, what then are we thinking as solutions? Is the solution to think about how to make those communities that are, many of them pretty established, do we make them more climate resistant? Can you do that? Or do we need to think about moving existing settlements to higher points in the land and away from points where they might be flooding? And I imagine none of these are easy questions.
Gooks, I'm telling you, if I didn't know that you were a radio presenter, I would think you are a planner yourself or an environmentalist. Many of these things that you spoke about are true, and that there's no lie to it. But the issue is that, can we do more? Yes, we need to do more. And I will tell you, for example, why are informal settlements? They are not supposed to be emergent forces that they're not supposed to be there, but they emerge as a result of the failure of the city, the high prices of rental costs, and even in the main cities of houses, the scarcity of it, the demand is not meeting the supply. So that means we need to scale up our supply of housing needs so that we are able to meet up the supply, the demand. And if you take it vis-a-vis again, you take it the other way, you ask yourself again, have we done well in our planning regulation, environmental regulation with regards to even the existing building? The answer is no. Can we do better? Yes, we can do better. And one of the ways that we can do better is even the houses that are built, there should not be unnecessary expansion. One of the presentations that we have within the SACHI Chair for Inclusive City during the last flood incident in KZN, we found out that one of the drivers of flood in those areas were issues around extensions of these RDPRCs, and even building along waterways and drainage ways. And these have implications on the environment, not just for the youth, for even everybody. So it's a combination of both physical, social, and financial sustainability. Financial sustainability, there's a need for more investment in, for example, climate waste infrastructure or water collection infrastructure. We need to invest in it heavily. We need to increase our investment. Yeah, some municipalities like the Tokyo municipality are trying their best, in Cape Town also, but there's a need for increased investment. The other thing that is also very essential that we found out is that to manage these climate disasters, yes, informal settlements are not supposed to be in place, but situations where they are emerging, there's a need for quick response and reintegration or regularization. These settlements have emerged. Can we now redesign it in a way to make it sustainable? Can we redesign those settlements to provide homes, RDP homes in those areas for these people? So these are initiatives that government must begin to visit and think about. They are not easy way to it. It takes hard ball and hard work.
Doctor, the other thing, I guess, and it's more obvious in the South African context is, not only are our cities meant to be safe, resilient, sustainable, which we've spoken about, they're also meant to be inclusive. Certainly, at least according to the Sustainable Development Goals. And part of when we talk about inclusivity is, narrowing inequalities. So, not having these very big gaps between people who have and people who do not. South Africa, and it has been for many years, is the most unequal country in the world, meaning that gap between the rich and the poor is quite wide. And so, and I was reading something that said inequalities in cities have grown over the last, I think, 3 or 4 decades. And so that also sounds as if that's another, I guess, big question or challenge, or part of the question is, in addition to building cities that are livable, that are safe, that are resilient, people shouldn't be living in cities but living in poverty or living in squalor, because then we don't quite reach we don't tick the box of this is also an inclusive city. And so, what are some of the challenges there of making cities inclusive? Because part of it is almost built into its DNA. If you look at South Africa, for instance, we always make this example of Sandton and Alex. It's in the very DNA of Joburg to have this big inequality. So how do are there global examples of where we've dealt with inequalities in that way?
I agree, and your question is very apt and needed at this time. And on Thursday, one of the presentations from which I have a keen eye to from one of our presenters is looking at issues around exploring pathways for youth-led urban climate. Our friend and our colleague from Japan, Dr. Prince Abuaye, will be discussing on that. And from what our discussions and what I sense that we'll be touching on are some of the how cities can respond to the youth need. The easiest way to solve all the problem that you're talking about is to invest in the future. And how do you invest in the human future? Invest in the youth. Once you invest in the youth, you are able to cut the gap and the inequality issue. And you find out that you close the economic gap and you close the resource access gap. And I agree with you. If you look, for example, some cities around, not even cities, the African Development Bank president, Dr. Additional, was giving a lecture over the week, and he argued that investment in youth will assist Africa to rapidly achieve sustainable goals. And I agree. For example, many households, for example, in South Africa and even Southern Africa as a case, many of them are now being led by youth population. And when you invest in this youth population, you find out that you're able to close this gap. Without investing in this youth population, whether socioeconomic investment, whether educational investment, you cannot close this gap. For example, a youth that is not educated as regards environmental behavior cannot engage in activities or be environmentally reasonable, so to say. That's why you see most of these informal settlements, you see them, they are so dirty. And I ask you the question, make a survey, ask questions, how many of them are educated about environmental, limited number of them. So when you look at this side by side, you look at in key and rapid and conscious investment in the youth is the easiest pathway to escape this problem. That's what Europe did over the years, and 40, 50 years ago. They consciously invested in it. That's what China did. The emergence of many industries was a result of their conscious investment in the youth. And when we do that, we're able to do it. And it's very important, just like you hinted, that nobody is immune. Mm-hmm. Nobody is immune. Once a youth is affected, you find out that almost directly or indirectly, it trickled down to the entire household. So that's why we did the Saatchi Chair for Inclusion. When it comes to inclusion, we argue that one person excluded in a family, it's an entire family excluded. One person excluded in a family, it's an entire family excluded. That's why within the Saatchi Chair for Inclusive City, led by our Professor Magnesha Chipungu, our argument is that no one should be left behind.
And so, Doctor, there are some pretty big questions that yourself, your peers are discussing, doing research around and studies. But is there, and often when we speak about particularly the issue of climate change and how it's going to impact youth, especially in developing countries like Southern Africa and large parts of the continent, the African continent, it can feel a little bit like doom and gloom. But are there some I guess promising, cautiously optimistic signs in terms of, the research we're doing, what we are learning about, how we can make cities more sustainable, especially on the African continent?
Yes, there are. There are success stories across the globe. And I'll give you an example. I just came back from Tanzania and I visited about 3 cities there, Morogoro City, Dar es Salaam, and at the same time, Dodoma. And one of the things that I found out was that myself and my colleague, we came to a conclusion that there's a relationship between government policy of environmental policy and how clean or dirty a city is. And I'll give you, and I'll say it to you the way I saw it. I found out that city was somewhat neater. There was lesser dirt, lesser dumping of polythene bags and nylon bags on the floor. And I asked the question, myself and my colleague were having that conversation. I asked the question, what do you think contributed to it? He said, because they introduced a policy that says no polythene bag. So they had a paper bag that was reusable. And that's a success story. A success story, one policy that translated to environmental sustainability. Yes, they have other aspects that they are trying to do, but that's one policy. You mentioned about Lagos. Lagos is trying to invest in their transport infrastructure now. They just introduced the red line, the blue line, which is a mass transit train, urban train traveling within the city. These are projects that helps the city. What's the implication of that? Reduce car emission, pollution. What's the implication of that? Increase sustainability. Because when you talk about resilience and sustainability, you are talking about capacity, futuristic use. One train is able to move about 300 or 200% at once. Reduce pressure on infrastructure. The expansion of their investment, even on their water transport, is really about increased environmental use. And you find out that these are implications, these are success stories somewhat across Africa. Mm-hmm. So when you look at these things, you say that, it looks small, but they are good success stories that are coming out of Africa. There's also investment by the World Bank across Africa now in solar energy across various cities in Africa, from Nairobi to places like Rwanda, for example. And you find out that these are investments that we need to look at. For example, in South Africa, why we need to visit? There are cities and there are homes that are exploring solar panels. Maybe it's something that we need to start exploring to bring about that sustainable energy for our cities. Individual homes exploring issues around solar, not just dependent on the national grid, as some countries like Nigeria have been having issues of grid collapse over and over again. So when you look at these things, you look at the relationship between, and more importantly, individual behaviors. These are things that we must be conscious about. Going back to my trip to Tanzania, which I told you, I found out that almost everywhere on the street, there's a landscape, landscape architecture or something. Someone selling a flower, someone selling a tree. You find out that there's a behavior of tree planting in that particular region of Africa. And my colleague was telling me that it's an East African thing. Can it be a South African thing also? So that homes don't keep on cutting down their trees and be engaging in that behavior to say, look, I need to maintain this portion of my home for green so that it enables and help our environment, controls our pollution. These are some of the bits, not just excluding the policies of the government, as you know, which is very essential, but these are some of the things that we can do as individuals, and some social stories that are coming out from across Africa.
Yeah. Doctor, I must thank you very much for making time for us this morning. It's been great to be in conversation with you.
Thank you very much, Gooks. I hope to see you 31st of October.
Thank you so much for your time. That is Research Associate and the South African Research Chair's Initiative Chair for Inclusive Cities at UKZN, Dr. Ayobami Popola, joining us this morning.